Thank you.
Yeah.
Mr. Singh, in your written testimony on page 3, you talk about the fact that there is ongoing disputes between members of the GCC and that has caused limited cooperation. Has that limited cooperation, please tell us how it has impacted the region as a whole?
Sure. Thank you, Congressman. I think that the split in the GCC between Qatar on the one hand and Saudis, Emiratis, Egyptians who are outside the GCC on the other hand has been troubling for the United States, because I think we had hoped to forge an alliance between the GCC, other like-minded states in the region, and ourselves to tackle common threats like terrorism, the threats posed by Iran, and so forth. And this dispute has undoubtedly distracted from that. It's also probably arguably led the Qataris into closer relationships with, say, the Iranians, the Chinese, and Russians, and so on and so forth. It is a long-standing dispute, and so we shouldn't be surprised, I think, by it. I think there's a larger problem, though, in the region that this is just one part of, and that's just poor coordination overall. We've seen traditional political groupings like the Arab League diminish in importance and effectiveness. This region has the least economic integration of, I think, any region of the world. And so it's the overall integration, not just militarily, but also diplomatically, economically, which I think limits the effectiveness of, say, these partners to solve problems within their own region.
And then, Mr. Singh, you also said in your written testimony on page 5, you said, in your view, it would be a serious mistake to jettison our partnership with Saudi Arabia or other Gulf allies. Could you expand on that very briefly?
Absolutely. Well, you know, I think that there's two reasons for that. Number one is these alliances we have in the region are not just about accomplishing things through the allies. It's about preventing adverse scenarios, preventing worse outcomes. We want to influence Saudi decision-making so that they make better decisions. That's obviously challenging right now. We want to see stability in these countries. Instability in a place like Saudi Arabia could be devastating for our interests in the region. Over time, I think if we're serious about reallocating resources to other regions of the world, about a great power competition strategy, we will need to work more through allies in this region if we're not going to simply put our interests aside. And so that means that over time we have to turn them into allies like the Israelis, like the Emiratis to some extent, who can act in our stead, in a sense. And so, look, these are the allies we have in the region. If it weren't for difficult partners in the Middle East, we wouldn't really have any partners, would we? And so turning these partnerships into better partnerships needs to be our goal.
And if we were to end this relationship with the Saudis, do you believe that it would damage our ability to influence them as it relates to improving issues such as human rights in their country?
Absolutely.
And then finally, a kind of a follow-up, and I think you touched on this earlier, on page 7 of your written testimony, you say that the withdrawal of U.S. support to the GCC coalition or the suspension of U.S. arms sales to Saudi Arabia or the UAE are unlikely, to end the conflict or ease humanitarian conditions in Yemen. Do you still feel that way?
I do, yeah. I think it's important to bear in mind that as we have this conversation about our security relationship with the Saudis or with the Emiratis, that is not the same as talking about a strategy to end the conflict, the multiple conflicts in Yemen. If we were to withdraw our support, yes, we might increase the difficulties the Saudis have in sustaining their operations, but I don't believe the conflict would end. I don't believe that the other conflicts in Yemen would improve either. Nor, frankly, do I think we'd absolve ourselves of responsibility for our longstanding involvement in the conflict.
And Mr. Sullivan, as it relates to Mr. Singh's answer to the last question, do you agree or disagree with his assessment?
I agree to the extent that it would not end the conflict, of course. I don't agree that it would have no impact on the conflict. I believe that the threat to reduce or curtail our aid has, over time, made the coalition make different and, in my view, more constructive decisions. At the end of last year, they were more likely to enter the Stockholm Agreement because of what the Senate did. Earlier, CENTCOM withheld certain provision of various types of technologies, minesweepers and other things, and it changed their calculus as respects HODEDA. So I do believe the United States deciding to pull back its offensive support to the coalition would have an impact on coalition decision-making that I believe would be positive. And even if it didn't, I would argue we have only contributed to a worse situation by being in, and so we should no longer be in.
Can I just make one point in response to that? because I don't think we fundamentally disagree, but I think that having that leverage and achieving those outcomes requires that there be some possibility that you'll continue the partnership if they take certain actions. If you just cut the support off, then you don't have that leverage.
And to clarify, I'm not saying cut off the partnership with Saudi Arabia. I'm saying cut off certain systems that they are using and certain assistance that they are using to bomb civilians in Yemen. We have plenty of leverage through the broader security partnership with Saudi Arabia that we can bring to bear in a constructive dialogue with them.
Yeah, I just want to add one point on this. I mean, UAE is actually also quite involved on the Hodeidah operations, and so that's an element that I think that we're missing in this conversation as well. So, you know, if you cut off the relationship with the Saudis, you're also going to cut off the relationship with the UAE over Hodeidah. I don't think that we will, or at a minimum, we need to discuss it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Trone.
Thank you all for coming here today. In your written testimony, Mr. Sullivan, you spoke about actions taken by Saudi Arabia in the last